Now, one thing I'll say is this, right? And there's a reasons why I brought this concept up. There's a reasons why I bring up this dynamic, right? When I talk about V equals V and P equals P or P, right? Now, what does that mean? Vagina equals value and penetration or penis equals power or provision. Now, I think this is a very important concept to understand. If your goal is to take a masculine dominant role, you cannot integrate from that masculine dominant role unless you have a capacity to protect your submissive sexual ego and your submissive ego in general. And then from that place to be able to teach whatever it is that you like, or to choose a person who has the attributes to take you there, right? So that you can integrate your submissive sexual ego back into that individual or into that individual once they've met your standards. So when I talk about the concept of V equals V and P equals P or P, that's a simple equation. It's very general because there's women who know how to utilize the value of their vagina and their attractiveness, right? To use teasing, edging pleasure to tap a man into his submissive sexual ego so that when he waits a long time and he finally hits it, he's probably gonna nut fast, right? Like I said before, when a dude meets a woman and he's already fucking her in his mind, then if he has to wait 3 weeks to have sex with her, he didn't nut in 2 minutes, he nutted in 3 weeks in 2 minutes. And I've met women who moved in this particular way, had a nice guy, decided to take a chance on a nice guy, right? And some of those women would be constantly playing games with the pussy because something in them understood that if they gave it up too easy and continued to give it up easily, after they got into a long-term relationship with this man, that the pussy may start to lack its luster that it initially had. So it'd be constantly playing sex games, right? Another thing to understand is this. The same way that the average man feels about a promiscuous woman is the same way, right, that the average woman is going to feel about a bisexual man or a dude who is very emotionally easy, right? Now, why is that? It's two things to really understand, right? Two things to understand. One, it's the submissive sexual ego. And then two, it's placing value on the emotional investment or the sexual access or the sexual or emotional access based off of how hard you had to work to get it. So that's one thing, right? If you recognize that an individual is making you work for something that they've given to other people very easily, right? Or they give it up to you too easily and you view that as how they typically are and you're submissive at heart, then you're going to get turned off by how easy you gain access to something. Because there's a difference between easy and priceless, right? If a man meets a woman and she sexually desires him from the rip because she's very attracted to him, right? Very sexually attracted to him. That's not easy, that's priceless. But if that woman wasn't open to having sex with him initially, or she was open to it but not willing, but then after a coffee date or a trip to McDonald's, she's ready to bust it wide open, that's easy. That's having, if you're going to be transactional, having a low price on yourself is something that lessens your value. Understand this. Now also, like I said, V equals V and P equals P or P. What does that mean? When I say that vagina equals value, I'm basically talking about how unless someone is extremely judgmental, whether someone is a man or a woman, they're going to be praised, right, for having sex with women. And whether someone is a man or a woman, someone's past by the average person is going to be scrutinized and looked at under a microscope for allowing themselves to be penetrated. Right? So this is why I say that although I'm not a man who judges body count like that, and I'm not a man who is seeking to be overly scrutinizing of a woman's sexual past, that's because I moved from a dominant stance to being the primary giver of pleasure, primary receiver of control. But when you're giving up control, you want to give up to control to someone who has control of themselves. Right? See, the thing to understand is when I say P equals P or P, this is the concept to really grasp. Penis or penetration equals power or pleasure. That's the big P. And then you have provision, which is the little p. Right? Which means that a person is allowing you to penetrate them either because you're providing something emotionally, socially, or financially. This is a transaction. This is provision. This isn't intrinsic sexual desire. This isn't intrinsic desire to engage in that behavior. This is because of the price that has been offered to you that makes you willing to give up control in the manner of being penetrated. Now, an individual who has never been penetrated or who has always set a high price for this, or who has protected their submissive sexual ego, when they encounter an individual, right, and they seek to take a masculine dominant role, their submissive sexual ego has been protected. So that means that they can meet an individual, set a price, right? Set a price and still be able to integrate their submissive sexual ego into that relationship as they get deeper into that relationship. Now, if an individual has experienced power or pleasure, high levels of pleasure and desire, then they put themselves in a situation where they either have to be dishonest, right? Or the person that they're with may feel as if they are only there for the purposes of a beard or a social mask, or there for the purposes of comfort, and not actually feel as if they're an individual who is desired. Right? Something to understand is that the submissive sexual ego, it's something that can bleed over into the emotional space. It can bleed over into the feminine submissive. Right? So when the average man is concerned about a woman's body count, yes, he may say something along the lines of, oh, she's stretched out. That's not true. A woman who's comfortable, right? If you understand canoeing and you understand ballooning, a woman who is comfortable, who's very aroused, she may balloon or she may canoe to be able to encompass more, right? This may be something that happens right before she squirts or has a G-spot orgasm, right? Or if she gets highly aroused and comfortable, sexually comfortable, where that desire overrides the need for comfort, then her body can encompass a larger penis. And from that space, that can become the new normal, to where less than that may not be as pleasurable of an experience as it would have been before she had that experience. Something I often say is that overstimulation leads to duplicity. Now, what does that mean, right? What does that mean? Anytime you become accustomed to pleasure that is beyond what you have a capacity to teach, then that pleasure, the highest peak of pleasure, becomes the new place of authority. Now, this authority may not be something that coincides with a motivational system that helps push you forward in life or in that relationship dynamic. It may not. Right? So that means that you would be unable to integrate with that peak of pleasure. You may not be able to. So what I'm really talking about here is this process of integration. So let's say a woman has many sexual experiences, many sexual encounters, right? She's dealt with very dominant men, some large penis men, right? Now, if she's had some big dicks, but they weren't able to really give her orgasms, or there was more pain than pleasure and the pain didn't mix with the pleasure, then even if she was a prostitute, I know this is going to sound crazy for some guys, but even if she used to be a sex worker, if she's never had cervical orgasms, especially she's never had consistent orgasms from penetration, her submissive sexual ego is still something that is protected, because masculine energy stifles submissiveness. So being transactional about sex is something that prevents this from taking place, right? Not 100% of the time, but most of the time, right? Now, what does that do? What does that do? That leaves it so that the possibility of sex mixing with emotions for that process of integration, when she meets a man who she actually wants to be with, is something that still has a capacity to lead to this bonding, pair bonding factor. And yes, pair bonding doesn't work exactly the way that people talk about it, but I have my own perception of it. When the person who makes the most sense for you to be with, who meets your standards non-sexually, if they are unable to give you peak levels of pleasure, then that becomes a situation when they are merely the person who is for the sake of comfort and not a person who is actually for the sake of passion. See, like I said, the same reason that the average man feels intimidated by a woman's sexual past is the same reason that the average woman, even if she's bisexual, will have an issue with a man who is bisexual himself. Because if that's what he's truly attracted to, if that's truly what gives him his peak levels of pleasure, then she becomes someone who is only for the purposes of emotional safety or emotional validation, social validation, and finances, right? She becomes a beard. Now, I'm not somebody who's anti-gay people. I'm not anti-bisexuality. I'm a heterosexual man, but I'm just talking about this, the reason why certain fears, the reason why certain visceral disgust pops up. And yes, men tend to be carriers of some of the more dangerous sexually transmitted infections. So whether that's a man or a woman being penetrated by men, especially when you take the condom off, that's something that puts you in a position where you're at a higher risk. And also, I believe that there's something that occurs once the submissive sexual ego has been tapped into on a high enough level to where pain can mix with pleasure. And this is something that can extend outside the bedroom with what you're willing to put up with to be with that individual. But also, I believe it taps into the feminine submissive. It taps into a certain level of penetrative orgasms for men or women, because men have prostates, just like women have the G spot, the A spot, the O spot, the cervix, right? And this is something that makes this an intrinsic desire. Once you've experienced an intrinsic desire and an intrinsic reward for giving up control to something, you put yourself in a position where doing something from a transactional model will feel like self-betrayal. It'll feel as if you're settling, and it'll feel as if you're not truly fulfilled, right? That's like, I remember going into college, right? When I was in high school, I performed well. When I first got to college, I performed well. But once I started to really understand and come into this thought process, this thought came into my mind. I was thinking, man, if I could have a school teacher salary doing what I love, which is music. Check out my new single, COVID Floor by Brody Dharma. It's out on all platforms. When this particular thing occurred, it became nearly impossible. And this is where discipline is so important, but it became nearly impossible for me to put the same level of effort towards my schoolwork as before I started making some type of money, making music and doing content and doing boxing lessons, right? Once you experience doing something from intrinsic reward and intrinsic desire, and then receiving something out of it, doing something that doesn't feel as fulfilling starts to feel like slavery. It starts to feel like you're prostituting yourself, even if it's a logical decision, even if it's the best course of action to take. And that's where the overstimulation of the submissive ego can limit a person's ability to take a masculine submissive route, or even a masculine dominant route at times, depending on what it is that they need to do. Important concept to understand. Now, you can get overstimulated in a variety of ways, right? Let's say if you are experiencing and grow accustomed and your palate shifts to something that's going to be outside of what's going to be long-term realistic for you, or what your goals are. Like if you desire to be in a monogamous relationship and then you become overstimulated with a variety of sexual partners in a short period of time, and the variety is what you become attached to rather than just the quantity of your needs being met, then you could put yourself in a situation where you're overstimulated for that type of dynamic, and you may need to, what do you call that? Practice some asceticism, some sexual transmutation, and slow the fuck down for a while. Because if what you desire is a monogamous relationship, being overstimulated with variety can make monogamy feel like a chore, or can make monogamy feel like a cage that's trapping you in, when really that may be the best scenario for you. Really may be the best scenario that you can find yourself in for your own life. Right? And the thing to understand is this: as long as the dominance that you experience can exceed what you've experienced before, and the level of submissiveness you can experience is higher than the level of submissiveness you've experienced before, then you can keep going up. But understand that the higher you go up with how dominant of an experience you're receiving from somebody, the less of a standard you're going to be able to hold about the treatment that you're receiving that's logical with your social program, right? And the more that is, the more you're going to have to be illogical, or the more you're going to have to settle in order to find a situation where you can be integrated. Understand what I'm saying? And I think this is something that oftentimes people don't talk about and they overlook. See, for the man who's afraid of a woman's sexual past and her sexual experiences, it's not so much that it will change her as far as how he feels experiencing her physically. What it will change is her capacity to view him from a superlative space, from her submissive ego, to actually appreciate what it is that he offers. So you could say that's the fear of comparison. You could say that's fear of inadequacies. You could say that's all different types of fears and insecurities, and it's true. But guess what? There is some realistic foundation and basis to this perspective. It's not all just the guy's insecure. And listen, I will say this: typically it takes a woman a certain level of experience to gain this. Like a woman can have enough experience to where she comes across a guy who just has big dick energy. He's very dominant, may not have a big dick, but he knows how to satisfy her. And he may even connect her emotions to it in a way that takes her further than she's ever been through intimacy. But it's just the route to getting there may mean that the man needs to be more secure than is reasonable for the average man that she may come across to be. Because understand that intimacy is when a person, like they say intimacy, I feel like that's such a cliche, but I feel like it's a very realistic and accurate cliche, right? Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by it is this: when it comes to how sex, vulnerability, intimacy, superlatives and the male ego, and sometimes even the female ego, relates to intimacy, is that the person who knows the most of what you truly desire, what you truly prefer, what you truly feel, what you've truly experienced, and is able to accept you, is going to be the person that you feel closest to on an intimate level. Now, the more that a person feels like they are what you truly desire when you express your true feelings, the more they feel as if they are near the superlatives, they've planted some flags, they're at the peak of your experiences, the easier it's going to be for them to listen to and to accept your past, your experiences, and the things you've gone through without feeling insecure or without feeling disgusted by who you are and what you've done. So a man could be a dominant man and say, okay, cool, I don't care how many dudes she's had sex with. And I've had enough experience knowing that bigger isn't always better. So that don't bother me. It's cool. But that same dominant man may say, well, I don't plan on being a man who wants to flip my own woman, the woman that I love. I don't want to be a man who is having group sex with my own woman where we running trains on her. So a woman who has had that experience, who likes that experience, who may want that experience in the future, I don't know if I can trust if she's never going to want that again. And I don't plan on offering this or being cool with her having that experience outside of me. So he may say, you know what? I'm not going to risk that being something she just didn't want to do. Now, keep in mind, what did I say? Pleasure or power. Pleasure/power or provision, which means that she was either in such a low place emotionally, mentally, financially, socially, that for the sake of the validation or the investment she may receive for putting herself in that position, she would be willing to do that, right? That may be like a sex worker. That may be like a woman who's very impressionable in high school or college. That may be a woman who was traumatized by her experience, or that may be a woman who did it for money, right? Now, if that's the case, then when she expresses how she truly feels, if that's something she's done, but that's something you want to do, but she's done it before, but she doesn't want to do it again because she doesn't feel like that's who she is anymore, then by proxy, it'll feel as if she's treating you as the provision guy, the guy who's there to give her comfort, but is willing to fulfill the fantasies of others that she isn't willing to fulfill for you. But if that's something she did from a place of power or pleasure, meaning that was an experience she really desired to have, and that's not an experience that you're willing to give, then you may not trust that she'd be truly satisfied just engaging with you on a one-to-one level. And it's a similar thing for how most women who are even bisexual would not want to be with a bisexual man. Why? Because she doesn't have a penis, right? She's probably going to get turned off and not going to be open to pegging a man, right? So for her to deal with a man who may have that is something that he was in such a low space that he was willing to allow himself to be penetrated, or that he may have trauma from his experiences that causes him to have certain issues, or that may be a man who truly desires that and he will never fully get over that desire for that. Her feeling that this is something that he desires that she will not be able to give is something that may lead to feelings of visceral disgust and fears of inadequacy that get projected onto that man as if he is a bad man for what he did. I'm just talking real to y'all right now. I'm talking real as fuck to y'all. This is how a lot of these situations can work, right? See, to integrate from the feminine submissive, that new person who you're being feminine submissive with typically is going to take you further into your submissiveness, further into subspace than your previous experiences to a certain extent. And then from that place, it makes it much more appreciated when they invest in you in the ways that stroke your own ego. And then from that place, certain things shift, But for the person on the other side of that, the masculine dominant, they have to have protected their submissive sexual ego so that after they take you to certain peaks, you're invested, and then they are also invested in you. You can then integrate and also tap into their submissive ego on a peak level. So for a man, if you've never been penetrated, then once you make love to a woman, once your emotions are involved, once you're locked in with the woman, then that pussy may be the peak pleasurable experience. Or some good ass head may be the peak pleasurable experience. If you know how to teach whatever it is you like, you know how to throat train a woman, right? You know how to teach her how to give you the 2-hand twist, got 5,000, spitty, slurpy, twisty hands. Then you have to understand that peak pleasure creates a form of attachment. It's kind of like addictions. And I like to look at it somewhat from a standpoint of think about church. And this is how things can work, right? Let's say an individual is addicted to drugs. I've seen it happen many times, right? And they go to church, they start worshiping God. Rather than feeling like they're doing it for God and they're just clapping their hands and they're not really present in the moment, something just clicks in them emotionally, spiritually. They have a physical experience within their body, the emotions that they have, because emotions are felt in the body the same way the sex is felt in the body. When they're able to attach that peak level of emotion and that pleasure that they experience during worship, and that gets attached to the principles that they follow in life and the guidance that they receive reading the Bible, then what that represents within the sexual polarity quadrant is the feminine submissive. That becomes the good D in guidance, because good D in guidance is the recipe for the feminine submissive, right? Respect and desire, right? Pleasure and purpose, pleasure and instructions. Now, instructions without peak levels of pleasure feels like work. It feels like legalism. It feels like you're being pressured to do something you don't really want to do. And like the Bible says, the law came so that sin would abound. Because you're just given a bunch of rules about things that you want to do that you can't do anymore, and you're not being given a certain source of pleasure that extends beyond what you've experienced out in the world. So it's something where you just work really hard, you experience psychological reactions. The taboo makes the pleasure, makes the desire even stronger for what you're running away from. And then you keep going back to it because every time you're doing right, you feel like you're earning the opportunity to break rules. Because that pressure leads to psychological reactance, and that psychological reactance intensifies the taboo. It intensifies the desire. When you do good for a little while, then you feel like you're in a place where you deserve to have a vacation from being in that process, right? It's like the masculine submissive is going to work, right? Going to work for someone else, doing something you don't really want to do on a daily basis for the provision that you're going to get out of it, right? But what happens if you feel very stressed at work, you get off work, you need to have you a drink, right? You need to go have you some sex, right? You need to go get high on something. You need to go do something that you can enjoy to do on an intrinsic level, that you're actually using the money that you got at work so that you can go engage in those behaviors, right? Now, the peak pleasure becomes the place of authority. So this is where discipline is a little bit different. See, it's easier to have discipline when you've protected your submissive ego. When you protect your submissive ego, then you can utilize the principle. Go from the place of principle to build yourself up to a place where the achievements and the accomplishments for your ego that you gain in doing the things necessary to get to a higher level are the new peak of pleasure. And by that being the peak of pleasure, that creates a positive feedback loop and a self-perpetuating cycle that leads to your growth in life and your growth in that relationship, right? So that's what the masculine dominant does. So you can go from masculine submissive to masculine dominant, right? But that's only if what you're disciplining yourself to is something that gives you a great sense of fulfillment. So let's say a woman is taking the masculine dominant role. Let's say she wants to wait for marriage. If she's a virgin, she's never had dick before, right? And if she has limited experience, but none of that was great dick, then she doesn't know what she's missing. So when she integrates with a man who is being feminine submissive towards her, after they integrate, they may end up going into their natural roles. Right? That may be what takes place. Because her lack of experience causes the man who's willing to invest from an intrinsic place and to make her feel comfortable to be the man that she's going to have the peak level of pleasure with once they get into that dynamic, and it's attached to the principle, so that that integration, that process, that program is on the same page. Therefore, that situation will be well integrated within that cycle of energy. Important concept to understand. But with the born-again virgin, if that born-again virgin has had all types of orgasms, had some huge dick, had some great times with it, then her, like, think about like Sierra and Russell Wilson, right? Sierra took a masculine dominant route dealing with Russell Wilson. He was investing in her, right? He fell in love with her pretty much right away. He decided, he pursued her because it's feminine to chase. He's on TV begging her to have another kid, right? Every interview he's talking about how much he loves her. But in every interview she's talking about herself. You look at their body language when they go on the red carpets, when they go to different events, and her body language is poised and masculine, but his is always leaning into her. If she didn't have the experiences that she had before she met him, right? Then she would be in a situation where, okay, cool. That would be her new peak of pleasure, where her emotions could mix with it. So the feminine submissiveness would arise. And then there would be an attachment that would form on that level to where she could be emotionally giving up control rather than giving up control or maintaining control. And I think that's a very important concept to understand when we're talking about integration and the things that are necessary to take place. Now, when you're a very dominant man, then you understand that not every woman that you dominate is going to be a woman you can integrate with, right? But when a woman gets to the place of the feminine submissive with you, if you are a man who also has structure, who also has principles, who also has a process, you set a path towards integration, right? You set out a path towards integration, then you're satisfied with what you have, right? Because there's a gap between logic and emotions. There's a gap between principles and pleasure. And integration is where the most logical, best decision for you is also where you have the most pleasure. So like, let's say you're a boss. You're running a business. You like being in control. You like having a product to sell. And you take fulfillment out of also being able to help the lives of those around you. And that's where a lot of the pleasure comes from, in being a masculine dominant, of having your service, right? Of being a teacher, of being a coach, of being a sifu, right? Of being a sensei. And then when they achieve things, you feel fulfilled. When you get your money, that's a fulfilling feeling. But the fact that there's purpose involved is what gives you fulfillment ultimately, right? That's the masculine dominant route of being a boss. But what's the feminine submissive? The feminine submissive at times could be more like, and you can integrate from there too, right? If you really intrinsically enjoy doing what you're doing. Now, let's say that we're talking about the feminine submissive who is integrating. And I'm not even talking about sex right now. I'm talking about like business and life. Let's say you spend your own money to go play video games. You get really good at playing those video games, right? You learn the system. You experience pleasure, the dopamine hit of the achievement that you have, and also just the intrinsic enjoyment you have of playing that game. Let's say you become a streamer, and then from that place of becoming a streamer, now you're making money doing what you do, and you can do that consistently, right? But there's going to be a period of time where it's not going to make money at first. If you're only doing it because there's something you want out of it, being financial resources, then typically that's not going to work for you. You're going to burn out. Let's say it's being an artist. Well, one, you got to take time to learn how to actually play that instrument or move that paintbrush. You have to invest money to get that instrument, to get that digital audio workstation, that DAW, to put time into learning how to actually do these things and learn how to express yourself in a way that other people are going to be receptive to. And then from that place, once you actually start making money enough to provide for yourself, doing what you're doing, and then now you can integrate from that feminine submissive stance of intrinsic desire and intrinsic reward into that being something where you've also gained the knowledge and the information necessary for you to be able to make a living doing something that you would do for free. Right? So when we're talking about protecting the submissive sexual ego, there's a lot of things that go along with it. So like as a man, one thing you can do to protect your submissive sexual ego is this. Don't engage in a lifestyle that would be too contrary from the lifestyle that you would ultimately want to live. Another thing is this, and this is something I've done naturally, right? I don't focus on how good the pussy is of a woman I'm sleeping with unless I'm near the point of being ready to integrate with this woman to where I want to feel a little bit more attached, bonded, and close to this woman through the pleasure that I receive, right? If you don't know how to separate sex from emotions, it's going to be very difficult for you to be able to be masculine dominant, because once that emotion or that ego boost that you get becomes something that bleeds over into how you emotionally feel about yourself or the relationship, then it's very easy to go into the feminine dominant or to go into the masculine submissive, right? Like if how much they desire pleasure versus how much you desire pleasure becomes out of whack, then what can happen when that occurs is that if you're very principled, right, and you're very logical, and you say, okay, cool, well, I was masculine dominant, but now I want the pussy more than you want the dick, so I'm going to succumb to these shit tests, and I'm going to compromise so that I can get the pleasure that I need. That's what happens with the masculine submissive. With the feminine dominant, it's my emotions are invested and I really want to be in control, but I want you more than I want to do things in a principled manner. So now I'm willing to manipulate you. Now I want to control you by any means necessary. Your ego is overly invested. It becomes fragile due to the emotional investment. And then now it's by any means necessary, right? So what can that look like? That can look like, really wanting some money really bad. And you feel like you really need it. And you're in a position where you have to get there. You feel like you got to do it. It's by any means necessary. So you start selling drugs in a way that can hurt your community. Or you start becoming a stick-up guy, right? Negative things. So, I'm breaking these things down on different levels because there's a reason why people do feel the way that they do. I'm somebody who is not a fan of gaslighting people about their insecurities. There's a reason that you feel insecure, or there's a negative feeling or a disgust that pops up, and it's not all irrational insecurity. All fears come from a real source, right? All fears come from a real source. Some of these things are within the collective unconscious, and sometimes people will project these fears outward. Now, when you're able to get down to the root of what causes that fear, then sometimes you'll recognize that certain scenarios in which you experience fear, insecurity, is when you get down to the details, the nitty-gritty, it's not as big of a deal as you thought. That's kind of how you get over the fear of just a woman having been with a bigger dick before, right? You're like, okay, cool, well, she ain't even like it like that. Or, you know what, she's continuing to grow sexually throughout her life. So pretty much, regardless of size, to a certain extent, the next dick is always going to be the best dick. So as long as you're good with your skills, you're straight, all right? And as long as that woman treats you well, she desires you, she's available to you, you're compatible, everything is cool. But there are certain situations where a man can override that thought process, and then that woman is still attached to having those experiences that you're unable or unwilling to give. Now, something else to understand is this right here too. There is a powerful thing that comes with penetration, right? Which is where penetration with an actual penis. Because the woman gets to feel the throbbing. She gets to know that life can come out of this dick, right? Nut. She knows that it's actually experiencing intrinsic pleasure, right? Because when you're eating pussy, yes, if you're high enough on a certain level of desire, some men can even bust a nut eating pussy, right? Just like a woman can have an orgasm giving head. You know, throat gasms, the vagus nerve, that's a different conversation, right? So that is a level where that connection can take place. But for the most part, she knows that she's giving pleasure while she's also receiving pleasure. So it creates more of this thing of a mutual process of pleasure that's taking place at the same time. She knows that man may have to fight the nut. She knows that sometimes he may nut quick. There's a certain surprise factor, right? She gets to feel it throb. She gets to feel the heat. She gets to feel that this is real meat that's inside of her. Right? And this is why I say that, you know, I don't think that a woman can really necessarily fully replace real dick with the dildo. Because it's not something that's real. I mean, some can. If you're taken to a much higher state of pleasure, cool. But where does the integration come in at, right? The integration comes in at, and this is on a very small level, that she's receiving pleasure, but then pleasure is shared in the intimacy of that moment. You're just using a dildo, then she's the only one who's receiving pleasure. Yes, it might be a two-sided dildo, or it might be like if it's a woman with a woman, that might be rubbing up against her clit, but it's not the actual clit that's penetrating her. And likewise, a woman may feel the same way about using a dildo to peg a man who's used to getting fucked by real men. Now, I'll say this right here too. Somebody can reach a high enough level of feminine submissive to where they don't feel insecure or feel challenged by this. Especially if they accept it, especially if they reach the level of a cuckold or cuck queen fetish, or if they have high levels of compersion, and the emotional intimacy and emotional safety is so high in that relationship that they have a strong primary partnership, and that's not going to get broken, right? That's something that can happen, but that is not the norm, right? That's not the norm. That is not the norm. Those are exceptions. There are some women who like bisexual men. That's their preference. There's some women who genuinely prefer bisexual men. And there are also men who genuinely prefer women who have friendly pussy. But I even know a swinger couple where they have sex, that's just fun. But when they have sex with each other, they're making love. That's love. Other people is fun with each other. That's love. Right? Now, what occurs within this process? The woman within herself says the quickest way to dry her pussy up is to choke her, or is to do anything dominant to her. So really, when she's having sex with other guys, she's trying to blow their mind, being her dominant ego, to receive the energy of them getting turned out. But with her husband, she gives herself over to pleasure to be his submissive, right? So even if you're in a non-monogamous relationship, some of these concepts still ring true. You know, because you want to attach the highest levels of pleasure, the highest levels of fulfillment to the structure, the principles, and the dynamic that is going to govern different aspects of your life. This is Coach Brody. And also for a man, the man, if his wife doesn't like somebody, he's not going to fuck with her. If his wife doesn't like somebody, I mean, she'll need to explain why. But I think they were fucking with each other for a while, but then he just got to a point in his life where he said, you know, she said, listen, I don't mind sharing your dick, but I don't want to share your heart. And he said, understood. I think they may have been looking for a third for a while, you know, a girlfriend to share. But this is something to understand. For a dominant man, a woman does not mind sharing that man's dick because she understands she's probably going to get turned on by the fact that a feminine submissive woman, she's going to get turned on by the fact that other women want to fuck him, right? She's going to get turned on by that. But it's the mixture of sex and emotions. It's the mixture of the dominant and the submissive ego. It's the mixture of having the masculine peak and the feminine peak within that dynamic that truly leads to the integration, that really uplifts and upholds the integration. If certain things are underrooted in a way that throws off that dynamic, then oftentimes that will uproot a dynamic. All right? Like a woman can be feminine, submissive with a guy, experiencing the best dick of her life, right? And this can happen within the primer principle. Now, if she goes fuck somebody else, if that dick is better, she may change the way that she speaks and feels about her dominant. This new man may not have the same structure and guidance and wisdom to share with her about the path she's trying to go in life, or about what's going to strengthen that dynamic. And then now she has less of her submissive ego attached to that primary figure, which can undermine the dynamic. These are things that can take place. There are ways around these things, but these are things that can take place. So I'll say to a woman, it's not about a man being insecure all the time, but there's different levels of security. You don't want to put a man who's good for you in a position where it's forcing him to either walk away or to have to be much more secure than he's currently at the time. It's Coach Brody. I'm out.